So I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about strategic design. But given that this is TEDx Montreal, I thought before talking about myself as an architect, I'd talk about myself as a Montrealer and tell you a little bit about what led me from here to here, which started, jumping ahead here, which started here. So I am a Montrealer, born and raised, but just about on the cusp of my 17th birthday, I set out on a path to really explore academically, intellectually, ideologically, and then eventually professionally, a whole series of interests that led me through to visit and work in about 36 countries, live in about 7 cities, and then to return just about 2 years ago to Montreal to found my practice and continue being a dedicated Montrealer. The reason I wanted to just mention this is that these two facets, really being a Montrealer and having explored all of this over the course of 15 years, really led to one of the most important and I'd say foundational interests that really drives my continued practice today. And what that is really the appreciation, and I mean that both personally and in a very real way, of the complexities of our world. Being a Montrealer, I think it's fair to say that we live in a pretty complex city. As quoted here, Montreal is perhaps nothing if not a paradox, and I can remember the countless times I had to explain, no, I'm not American, yes, I am Canadian, no, I'm not Francophone, but yes, I am from Montreal, and perhaps my favorite, though this really only happened once, I'll admit, but it was at Princeton, was, no, that's not in Europe, but... So, you know, I think sort of being in Montreal and having grown up here, I think this idea of complexity and the appreciation of it and a real understanding of its richness, because I think Montreal's character is deeply rooted in this complexity. So understanding also the benefits and the joy of complexity, I think, came from being a Montrealer. Now, flash forward about 10 years later to the last of the chapters in this 15-year stint, and I found myself in Rotterdam, Holland, working for, as mentioned, the architect Rem Koolhaas at the office at OMA. Now, I don't know how or whether you guys are familiar with the office, but it's really an office that's deeply engaged in contemporary issues and also really founded on the exploration and engagement of the complexities implied by our age. And what working there really did was found and allowed me to explore and facilitated a very professional relationship to this deep, deep interest and understanding of complexities. And so there, the projects that I worked on, I think as mentioned, or perhaps in my bio, was one was a modernization master plan for the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. The interesting thing about this project is that it was premised upon the idea that rather than an architectural addition in the form of perhaps a glass pyramid or a crystalline shard, in fact, what the Hermitage needed to be truly contemporary already existed within its very composition and constitution. And so the project was a project about orchestrating the existing potential towards its true modern contemporary potential. And to do so in a way that actually extended far beyond the contemporary understanding of what museological practices were, to think far beyond into the future using a deeply sort of historic regard in terms of its history, its collection, and its architecture. The other major project that I worked on there was this North Sea master plan. And yes, master planning the North Sea was a little bit more ambitious than I had realized the type of projects I'd be undertaking. Nonetheless, it was handed off to me and became an interesting thing because the commission came from an NGO, and their mandate was essentially to put pressure on the Dutch government to meet their 2020 goals. And so I think, you know, largely maybe perhaps for PR reasons, they commissioned us to really start to think through the process. Now, initially, they asked us to look at the Dutch piece of the North Sea. So as perhaps you guys know, the North Sea is divided by each of the countries that border it and sort of divided like a pie. So this is the Dutch North Sea, as you know it. And they asked us to look at the Dutch North Sea, and specifically towards wind energy planning. So the more we started to look at it, the more we started to research it, the more we realized just how very little we knew. And though this started out as a very humbling thing, in fact, it became the root of understanding how it was exactly we could start to play a role within such a project, and also what it exactly was that we knew. So one of the first things we did is said, you cannot just look at this. In fact, you need to look at this. And we need to look at this strategically and think about it through time and think about it through space, from that scale to this scale, and then down to the human scale. So the thing that was interesting to me about these projects was that it started to form two very important questions that really precipitated my work today and my move back to Montreal. One of those was, why architects? Why were architects being asked to pursue this kind of work, and what was the relevance of our skill base in terms of these type of projects? The other question was, why now? And the reason for this is that architects doing this type of work or this type of thinking is in fact nothing new. It's actually, there's a huge legacy of thought and thinkers and great minds that have been dedicated to this type of systemic thinking within the discipline. However, what is different now than then is that their work really never managed to escape the confines of the discipline. It never really happened that their work manifested in the real world. I'm speaking of, for instance, he wasn't an architect, but we could call him such. We like to appropriate him. But Buckminster Fuller, for instance, Doc Stiatis is another, perhaps you've heard of, Cedric Price. So these were great minds, but in fact, their work never was realized. But there was something about now that was happening. There was something about now that was leading other people to solicit the work of us as architects in these type of problems. So it was these two questions that really brought me back here and led me to the founding of the practice and really lie at the foundation of the practice. So why now? We live, and I'm sure this goes without saying, an incredibly complex world. To illustrate it very simply and basically, we can look simply at the population as it has evolved through time and where we stand right now within an incredibly accelerated field. You can see on the left the occupation of the world through time, the presence of humans on the earth, and how deeply and quickly this is changing. Now, there's nothing wrong with this, right? I mean, it's actually incredibly exciting. We have sort of a massive proliferation of knowledge, of understanding, of human endeavor, of intelligence that's just been unprecedented, and this is unbelievable. Now, the only problem is that when you think about all those things in terms of our built environment, it becomes a bit more complicated. And the reason for that is that for the most part, development has occurred by singularly driven, singular imperatives. So the need, for instance, to transport goods, meet the technological developments that could facilitate it, led to massive proliferation of, for instance, rail networks across the globe. Similarly, the need to do so across from continent to continent led to massive shipping infrastructure and port systems. Similarly, the need to transport people from place to place and automobiles led to massive road infrastructures across the world. And similarly, the needs to meet the sociological imperatives to simply have comfort and human comfort led to the patterns of human settlements that we see here, of course, extremely varied. Now, very simple portrait, but the important thing about it, right, is that if you look at any one thing, nothing's wrong. When you look at it together, you start to realize we're starting to very, very, very seriously saturate our world. And when you think about the type of development that's happening in terms of human population, right, between 1950 and 1985, population doubled. We're set for the same thing to happen again by 2025. So we're reaching a population now of 10 billion people, 10 billion people's worth of endeavor in a world that's already starting to look like this. So there is a critical imperative now to abandon the paradigm of singularly driven development towards a much more creative, a much more synthetic, and a much more strategic approach to design. So this is really the foundation of our work, and it's really what I call strategic design. And to me, it's very allied to the work of architects. And why architects? Architects, we know, build buildings, right? But I'll use this example here. This is the Bauhaus building by Walter Gropius in Germany that was built in 1925. Iconic building, incredibly important in terms of its architecture, but if we scratch the surface a little bit of what the architect is actually doing here, in fact, that building is really the product of really synthesizing a whole set of complex parameters from the human to the spatial, and of course to the technical, into an optimized whole that can perform on all those levels. Not only is it optimized, but it has to be done projectively, right? We as architects never build what is, we build what will be. And so we have to also understand the future into which our projects will be inserted. So at its best, architecture is something that actually transcends the efficiency of this simple synthesis, right? And actually becomes something that sets all those things into a productive relationship that can perform over time and answer to the evolving needs that the future implies. So this is strategic design. It is architecture, but it is architecture beyond architecture. It is a system and its methodology, and it's really what we do at the Commons. So, sorry, my practice is the Commons Inc., and it's really based on this premise, which is much more methodological than it is stylistic, scalar, or necessarily always built. So what I wanted to do is talk to you a little bit about our projects. I realize the time is somewhat short, so I'm just going to take you through one that's specific to Montreal, but I think really encapsulates the thinking. In general, the type of work that we do really exists within the three domains that you see here: cultural development, urban development, and also large-scale territorial development, which is on the scale of, for instance, the North Sea Master Plan, energy infrastructures, and also industrial and resource extraction. So the project I wanted to show you, though, today is for the Empress Theatre. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. You might perhaps recognize it better this way, as it once was as Cinema 5. It's located on Sherbrooke Street West in NDG, just about west of Girouard and Décarie. And it's on a pretty interesting stretch of Sherbrooke. Sherbrooke, as you know, is sort of one of the major axes of the city, but in fact, in this part, it's a little bit underdefined, and in fact, really, I think, ripe for development and growth, and hugely potent right now in terms of its future. So the building itself, though, was a Art Deco building built in 1927. It was one of the first atmospheric theaters in the city, and looked like that then, and looks a little bit like this now. What happened, basically, is that it went through various repurposing. It was a cinema, of course, Cinema 5. It then became a famous players' theater, but it underwent a pretty dramatic fire in the early 90s that left it in the condition you see here. In terms of its importance and relevance to Montreal, however, it really ushered in this era of these atmospheric movie theaters and movie palaces. Here you see the lay of the land in 1950. Here you see what's happened to them today. It's also one of a very significant building in the larger context, simply because at the time, this Egyptian-style theater became very popular in the 20s. They discovered King Tut's tomb, and this launched a massive stylistic movement across North America in celebration of this incredible finding. But I think also, sort of fascinating in terms of the fascination that was held for international ideas and sort of the world at large at that time. Anyways, of about 100 that were built, there are 10 that remain, and this is the only one that exists in Canada. So to me, the building really inherently had these properties. It had relevance and importance in terms of itself as a building. It had relevance and position in terms of its community and the people that experienced it through decades. It also had relevance at the city, and it also had importance and relevance beyond. And so the mandate that was given to us was, what do we do with this thing? How can we possibly reform and repurpose this building that has been left derelict and has a few other issues. One was a board that was mandated with its repurposing, and these were really the three pillars that they had to meet. It had to be heritage protected, and respect the heritage of the building. It had to have a cultural vocation, and it had also to deeply engage the community by which it was surrounded. The other little caveat was that this building needed some massive and an extremely massive investment in terms of turning it around, simply because of the devastated state that it was in and also the historical importance of the building itself. So the question became, how can we deal with all of these parameters that don't necessarily favor its repurposing, but certainly make it difficult, but very interesting, to think about what it could become. The necessity of that price tag imposed a certain pressure. The interests of the board imposed another pressure. And so what was previously singularly a cultural vocation, a culturally dedicated building, now had to become something more. But the real challenge that I put forth was, could this kind of equation look something more like this? Could these different factors actually be put into a productive relationship by which they did not necessarily simply coexist, but actually could become productive partners to create a whole that was certainly far greater than the sum of its parts? And furthermore, how could this then relate to what I felt was very important in terms of the building's potential, its existence at the multiple scales? And I'll note also, I think very important for Montreal to think also in terms of these various scalar components. So what we did is we initiated a series of analyses. A very important one was sort of really looking at the cultural landscape of Montreal urbanistically, but also in terms of its qualitative character. What was emerging out of Montreal and why? We started to look at also the immediate vicinities. Who was the market for this building? Who would be coming to this building and why? It's always thought of in terms of NDG, but as you can see, it's actually at the center of a whole other western front that for the most part, here you can see, is rather underserviced. We also started to look a little bit more at the hidden dimensions of the building and the hidden potential of the urban context. And what you see here is a study that was precipitated by a little study that I had read, which was looking at the creative content in Canada. They looked at how the creative quotient and the creative percentages of practitioners and creative types that lived within Canada. But what was interesting is that they took it down to such a granular level that they did postal code by postal code, the creative quotient in Canada. I know you'll be happy to know that Montreal came out on top. Which, yeah, of course, to be expected. Maybe perhaps also to be expected is that the highest concentration within Montreal was really along the Plateau Mile End corridor. What was maybe a little less expected was the fact that there were 3 other postal codes that actually far exceeded the national norm and even Montreal's average norm. And one of those was the postal code in which the Empress sits, the H4A. This intrigued me, and what I got very interested by was whether there was a pattern that we could discern that could support the reasoning for this. And what I was thinking is that, you know what, maybe there's something beyond the lay of the land that's happening. Maybe we need to look literally underground. And what you see here is the cultural growth that's happened over the last 5 years mapped against the orange line of the metro. And what we realized is, in fact, there's a whole axial connection that's happening along the orange line that's not legible from the surface, but as soon as you start to do this, becomes even more so. Anyhow, we started to put all these pieces together and also look beyond Montreal to what was going on in an international cultural context. And what you see here is an installation that was at the Tate Modern by Talia Dorsey. This just happened last year, and it was a whole installation dedicated to analog film. The reason for this is that what happened last year is essentially the production facilities and also the technical facilities and even access to the film stock itself became inaccessible to independent filmmakers and creative practitioners. So artists like Talia Dorsey, who has a major international profile, no longer had access to the lab and facilities and stock that she needed to use film as a creative medium. So we started to put all these pieces together, and this sort of, the way we work, it's sort of this swirling soup of sort of not knowingness until things start to crystallize. And ultimately, they did into this notion of the Empress as an analog institute. An analog institute that could answer to sort of its deep and rich cultural heritage, and also could engage deeply with the current contemporary culture, both within Montreal and abroad, and furthermore, perpetuate its presence and relevance into the future. So the building itself then would be comprised of multiple components. It would have a lab space, it would have a performance venue, it would have amenities that could support it, a cafe, a restaurant, replete with an urban agricultural component on the roof, and also a series of residences that could house artists and also visitors to the space, and also allow people in the local community to stay and use the space for these purposes. So this was interesting, but what was most interesting was the way that these different components and these different programs could start to interact. So what you see here is really an ecosystem of programs, the ways in which architecturally and programmatically the building can perform unto itself, and then also in terms of its larger engagement with its immediate surroundings, the city as a whole, the nation, and then internationally as well. So this is really the essence of, a sort of quick snapshot of what we do, but I think it's something that's so fundamental and so critical right now, to start strategically thinking about the ways in which we can all start to engage and synthesize all these complexities into a very, very smart and coherent and collective intelligence that will allow Montreal's sort of celebration of its complexity to thrive within a much broader context from here and beyond. Thank you.